All right, how's it going, everybody? So today we're going to continue on our discussion on sound, and we're going to look specifically at music. Okay, and so with our understanding of sound, I want us just to really kind of focus in on three different pieces of sound. Okay, so first one we're going to talk about today, we're going to be looking at the pitch of the sound. Okay, right? Are we talking about something very low or something very high? Okay, so we're going to look at the pitch of the sound. Then we're going to move on and talk about our intensity of the sound or the volume of the sound, right? Are we talking something very, very loud or very, very quiet? Okay, and then from there, we're going to finish out talking about the quality of a sound. Why is it that certain sounds sound more pleasing to the ear and ones that don't feel as much? Okay? So again, just as a refresher, when we're talking about a sound wave, we're talking about that longitudinal wave that has areas of compressions and rarefactions that are moving through space. Okay, so those are going to be very important for us to keep in mind as we start going through and talking about this discussion about the pitch, the intensity, and the quality of the sound that we're listening to. Okay. So the first thing that we want to talk about is the pitch of a sound. What is it about a sound wave that gives us different pitches? Okay. Well, simply enough, it's just the frequency of the wave. Okay, we talked about a couple days ago the limitations of our ears, right? We can hear something as low as 20 hertz, and we can hear something as high as 20,000 hertz. Okay, and everything in between that is going to be a different pitch that we can hear. And so if we're all the way down at 20 hertz, we are looking at a very, very low sound. As you start going up in that frequency, we start having higher and higher pitches that get higher and higher. Okay, and again, just because we cannot hear anything outside that range of 20 to 20,000 does not mean they don't exist. We just don't have the hardware to process those sounds. Okay, so that's really simple. The first bit, pitch is directly proportional to the frequency of the wave. Okay, and not only is it proportional, but they are equal. Okay, because you'll hear people talk about, oh, that pitch was this letter, and that letter is associated with a frequency. Okay? And so as I talk about letters, why are there letters in my music? Well, let's talk about it. So you have a scale of an A through G scale that we talk about if we're playing a certain instrument, right? You might hear somebody talk about like, oh yeah, that's a B note or a C note or a D note or things of those sorts. And the interesting thing is there's not just one of each of these letters. There are many of those letters, okay? And so how do we have different notes that are associated with the same letter? Well, there's something called an octave, okay? And people that are in music, you hear all the time talking about like, oh, I'm going to play this piece in the third octave, the fifth octave, whatever octave they're doing this in. Well, what does that mean? Well, like I said, we've got the basic A through G scale, and then once you get to a higher frequency than a G, you reset at an A. And then it goes all the way to G, and then it resets, so on and so forth. Okay? So what makes something of the first octave different than something of the second octave? Well, if we say the first octave, and I'm going to have a C note in that first octave, I'm going to say that it has a frequency of about 32 hertz. Okay, I believe it's 32.7 or somewhere in there. Let's say it's 32 hertz. Let's just round to make it nice and easy. Well, if I go through the entire, lettered alphabet to get to the next letter of the same note, right? So if I go from a C at 32 to the next C, I merely double that frequency. So if I go from the first octave, okay, so let me write this down. So if I start A, B, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, D, right? So I say here, this is 32 hertz. Okay. And I go down, I don't know off the top of my head what all the frequencies are for all the other letters, but if I get back here to C, I am going to double that value. Okay, so 32 times 2 would be 64 hertz. Okay. Now, if I go from if I label this as the first octave, and this is the second octave, right? D, E, F, G, right? I get all the way down to G, and I restart up here, right? So that's all first, okay? That's all second. Now let's say I do the exact same thing. I say that's all the third octave, okay? I don't go 32 to 64 and then add 32 to become the next one. No, I double it again. So here's where I doubled 32 to get 64. I doubled that again. 64 times 2 is 128 hertz. Okay. So again, anytime you are talking to a musician and are talking about octaves, they're talking about this range that they're going to oh, these are all the values here. Okay, now we're going to go to the next one. We're going to double all of those ranges, all of those frequencies, and we're going to go to the next one. And we're going to double all of those and go to the next one, so on and so forth. So even though the way that our brain hears, it may seem like that is a linear increase. In order for that to actually work, we are actually creating an exponential increase through those octaves. Okay, so that's part one. That is looking at the pitches of sound. Okay. Second thing we're going to talk about now is the intensity of the sound. Okay, how loud is something? Okay. Now again, this is where the idea of compressions and rarefactions becomes very, very useful. Okay, so if we have, imagine this whole area is air, and all those air molecules are evenly distributed across the entirety. There's no sound, right? There's no compression, there's no rarefaction. If I've got a sound wave that comes through, and the compressions compress it just a little bit, which means the rarefactions are decompressed just a little bit, and it moves through, that's going to be really, really quiet. You're not going to be able to hear that very well because the difference between the compressions and the rarefactions aren't that big. Okay, think about that as it hits your eardrum. As it hits your eardrum, it's only going to vibrate just a little bit. Okay, but as we increase the amount of compression in those compressions, and we increase the non-compression, the uncompression of the rarefactions, well, now as it comes through and it hits your eardrum, it's going to throw it way one direction, which means it's going to fly way back the other, and so on and so forth. And so that's where we get a loud sound. Okay? So the volume of something has to do with the differences between the amount of compressions versus the amount of decompression in the rarefactions. Okay? So let's kind of take some ideas that we already have and start putting that to give us a unit that we can associate with that loudness, right? We talked about the frequency and the unit of a hertz as our pitch. So what other unit can we use to talk about the intensity of that sound wave or the volume of that sound wave? Okay, and many of you have probably heard of the scale, not as I'm going to introduce it, but as I'm going to eventually get to. Okay, so the scale that we utilize for the sound is the Bell system, right? Alexander Graham Bell, debatably the person that invented the telephone. There's some argumentation on a couple other people that work on the same thing at the same time, but another story. The Bell system is our intensity or volume of sound. Now, many of you are like, I have never heard of the Bell system. Like, are we just ringing bells out there somewhere? No. The Bell system, okay, so one bell, okay, is 1 watt of power, right? That, I said those compressions, the more compressed they are, the more energy is there, and the more energy is pushed through a certain amount of time, oh, right, watts is work divided by time. So if I have a lot of energy, I have the potential to do a lot of work. And if I do that very quickly, I can divide it by time and I can get power, right? So this is an amount of power traveling through the air in this wave per amount of square meter, okay? So how much of that power energy is going through a square meter at a given time? Okay. Now, the name that you might be more familiar with is a decibel. Now, let's go back to the very beginning of this class. We talked about the metric system, right? And we said the metric system, we can take the Bell system and we can attach any whatever prefix we want to on there. And if we take a deci of something, if we take a bell and we divide it by 10, we get a decibel, a decibel. Okay? So that is where we get that unit that many people are more familiar with for the sound intensity or the loudness of a sound. Okay? So we're going to take the numbers of decibels. Now, here's where the decibel system gets a little bit tricky. Okay? So if we start looking at things that have different intensities of sound, we look at things that have different volumes to them, okay? If we have the threshold of hearing, and this is why we use the decibel instead of the bell on a regular basis, because if we start off at 0 decibels, this is the threshold of our hearing. We can't hear anything lower than 0 decibels. Again, we took that value of a bell, divided it by 10, made it smaller, and made that our threshold. There are things that are lower than that, but again, we don't have the hardware to comprehend them. Okay? So we're going to start here with 0 as that. As we go up, okay, so say I go up to 10 decibels, 20, 30, 40, 50. This scale is not linear. This scale works in such a way that it is actually logarithmic. Okay? A couple of you I know just squirmed a little bit hearing that term from math, but here, let me explain why it's important to understand that and what logarithmic actually means. So if I've got something that has, so this is our decibel system, okay? Now if we come over here and we look at our unit of watts per meter squared, right? That unit that we started with that we renamed as a bell, okay? If I take that value and I say that this is 10 to the negative 12 watts per meter squared. Okay? As I go up to 10, that's 10 to the negative 11. I go up to 20, that's 10 to the negative 10, 10 to the negative 9, so on and so forth. And you're like, okay, Mr. Wortman, that's a lot of math, that's a lot of numbers. What does this mean? Well, with the Bell system, as this value increases by 10 each time, right? So I add 10 each time, the actual amount of energy associated with it, we are multiplying by 10 each time. Okay? So let me repeat that again. As we add 10 to the decibel system, we're actually multiplying by 10 each time. So if I go from 0 to 10, I've multiplied the energy by 10. And if I go from 10 to 20, I multiply by 10 again, which means that 20 is 100 times more energy than 0. Right? Because 10 times 10 is 100. From 0 to 30, 10 times 10 to 10, that's 1,000 times more energy in that sound wave. Okay, so understand again, as we get to those higher intensities, those higher volumes, We are not just linearly increasing the amount of energy that is hitting our eardrums and affecting our hearing, but we are logarithmically just escalating that to a very, very extreme value. Okay? So that is something really, really important for us to understand as we're going up this scale. Okay? So from here, we're going to move on from our sound intensity, and we're going to talk about quality of sound. What is it that creates a good sounding sound? Okay? So what we can do is, again, if we look at the frequency of something, okay, we can say like, oh, that has a frequency of 30 hertz. And now we rarely have anything that has a single sound to it, right? If we think about music, it's not just a single instrument. We might have a guitar, we might have drums, we might have somebody with some cymbals, we have a vocalist, maybe you've got a cello, who knows? But whatever you've got, you don't necessarily just have single instruments. You have multiple things within that band creating music. Okay? Now, if we break that down, instead of worrying about the instruments, we look at just individual tones, we can add tones together to each other that we refer to as partial tones, right? Because if we remember back from a couple of days ago when we talked about interference, we said that each of these waves can come through and be in the same place at the same time. As they do that, they interfere with each other, either constructively or destructively. And as they come together and they cause that interference, it changes the pitch, it might change the intensity, it changes all these things as they interact with each other in different ways. And so if we have 5 different things making sound, they all come together and create this new interesting sound, this new interesting pitch, this new interesting thing that our brain is comprehending as music. Okay? So again, you're like, wait, yes, this happens, but you said you were going to explain why some things sound good and why some things sound bad. We have something known as harmonics, right? If you hear something that sounds good, a lot of people refer to that as like, oh, those two individuals are in harmony with each other. Okay? And there are things that aren't sounding very good, and you say, oh, they're not in harmony with each other. So what causes something to be in harmony and sound good to our ears? Well, if we take each of those partial tones and we look at their frequencies, we can actually get a really good understanding of what sounds good and what doesn't. Now, earlier on, we talked about octaves, and we said that if we go from one octave to the next, we are multiplying by 2 every single time, right? So something would go from 32 to 64 to 128, so on and so forth. With harmonics, we are doing something very similar, so we are multiplying by whole integers to get different sounds that sound good together. Now, the thing is, we are just multiplying. Say I've got that C that we talked about originally, that 32 hertz sound. I can multiply that by 2 and get 64, right? I would go from one octave to the other. Those two are harmonic. They sound really good to each other. But I can also take that 32 and multiply by 3, right? So with the octaves, I had to multiply by 2 every time. So, right, 32, 64, 128. This time, I'm going to go 32, 64, and if I add 32 to that, I get 96. Okay? All 3 of those we would say are harmonics with each other. If frequencies working together have multiples of each other, and there's whole number multiples of each other, we say they are in harmonics with each other and they sound pleasing to the ear. When you start having these frequencies that don't really match in any of these ways, it doesn't sound good to our brain. And I want to bring that up because a lot of individuals say that they are not good with math. And I say, you are not good with math as far as you are aware. But your brain subconsciously, right? Consciously, like, yeah, numbers, whatever. but subconsciously your brains are so in tune with numbers and math and rhythms that we don't even comprehend a lot of the times. Because again, you hear a frequency that sounds good or it sounds bad because your brain is doing the math subconsciously to be like, yes, that sound and that sound, they are harmonic with each other. That sounds pleasing to my ear. Okay? So there's a lot of stuff subconsciously that we don't understand yet. That yes, we're actually really, really good at math, whether we understand that consciously or not. So, all right, those are the three things I wanted to get through today. So we talked about the pitch of a sound is equal to its frequency. We say that the intensity or the loudness of a sound is proportional to the amount of energy that is associated with it, right, as the units of watts per meter squared, or more commonly understood as the decibel system. And in order for something to sound pleasing to the ear, we want it to be in harmonics with each other, meaning that the values of the tones, the frequencies, are multiples, whole integer multiples of each other. All right, that's it for today. Hope this helps. I'll talk to you guys next time. Bye.